So Cyrus named before birth. Many countries have their national heroes. Greece has Alexander, Mongolia has Genghis Khan, Iraq has Nebuchadnezzar, but Iran has Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was not only a great leader who was loved by his people, but a person that is described as temperate, self-controlled, and respectful to women. He had an extraordinary modern policy of returning exiles to their own lands. He was known for his wise sayings and outlawed slavery at a time when it was common practice in every country. So no wonder that he was beloved of his people and that his tomb is still a place of veneration today. But there was much more to show that here we're dealing with the greatest Gentile or non-Jewish king of all time. And Cyrus was not only a hero for his own country, but someone who would serve as a model for the men who will come to save the whole world. Usually, talks about historical figures start off with history, the lineage of the person, but Cyrus, who was born in 600 BC, his birth was foretold 120 years before he was born. So to understand the unique place in the history of the world of Cyrus, we've got to go to Jewish prophecy. And in the prophecy of Isaiah, 3 servants are mentioned in chapters 40 to 43. So they are Israel, the national servant, and also Hezekiah as a type of Jesus, who was the true suffering servant, and Cyrus, who was Yahweh's anointed. So it's important to distinguish them one from another. But today we're going to look at Cyrus as God's anointed and shepherd. Now, Jewish prophecies foretold of a time when a Jewish Messiah would come to relieve the oppressed and restore Israel to its former glory. There was another ruler mentioned in the Hebrew Bible who also was a type of this Messiah, whose name was given before birth. His name was Josiah. Nobody else was mentioned until Messiah himself, whose name shall be called Jesus. And we shall see how Cyrus foreshadowed the Messiah in so many amazing ways as we go through this talk. So we get to know Cyrus in the prophecies, not only of Isaiah, but also of Jeremiah, Ezra, and the Chronicles. But with this divine introduction, let us get to know, first of all, the historical Cyrus. Cyrus wanted to make sure that the world knew who he was. Now, he built a new capital called Pasargadae, and in the audience hall stands a column, you can see it here, which has an inscription, "I am Cyrus the King." So if you look closer up at the detail of this column, then you can see the inscription in 3 lines, in Old Persian, and in Achaemenid, in Elamite, and in Babylonian. And this is the name of Cyrus in Old Persian cuneiform script. And to show his important role in the international arena, he is also shown as the winged figure, having 4 wings. You see here's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, like a 4-winged carib. He's got an Elamite traditional dress, and on his head he wears an Egyptian ceremonial headgear. So this may be interpreted as either a winged genie or some form of idealized portrait of Cyrus the Great, possibly representing the king's fortune. So Cyrus established the Achaemenid dynasty, named after the legendary king Achaemenes, and his successors were famous kings like Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and Xerxes II. Now, Cyrus the Great, or Kurush Kabir, the Old Persian name has been interpreted in various forms, such as the Son, or the Elamite version has been translated as He Who Bestows Care. Now, in 1879, this inscribed barrel-shaped clay cylinder was discovered in the ruins of the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, and this is now in the British Museum. Now, the cuneiform text on the so-called Cyrus cylinder documents the conquest of the city of Babylon by King Cyrus of Persia. Now, if you've got difficulty reading this, as I have, then here is a translation. I'm Cyrus, king of the world, the king of Babylon, the king of Sumer and Akkad, the king of the 4 regions. But we can read it into English. Perhaps, David, would you like to translate this into Farsi? Okay, so I can go on with that then. So Cyrus was famous in the ancient world. The Babylonian priest recognized him as Marduk's earthly representative. The Jews saw him as God's anointed or Messiah, and the Greeks regard him as the supreme statesman and benevolent ruler. So Cyrus united the 12 tribes of the Persians and developed his kingdom into a great empire known as the Persian or Achaemenid Empire. And in the image of Daniel chapter 2, the empire of Cyrus is compared to silver, second only to the gold empire of Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of that vision, Jesus, who is represented by a stone, will destroy the territory formerly occupied by these nations and establish a kingdom of peace that will last for 1,000 years. Cyrus built a new capital in Pasargadae and constructed 2 large palaces with gardens and a nearby fortress called Tali Taht. So here's a picture of the partially restored private palace. And well, the Persian friends know all this. Here we see the remains of the palace gardens. You can see the plan, how it was laid out. And of course, a big fortress, the Tali Taht, the citadel, which was never completed, built on the south. Absolutely. Of course, we know about the well-known tomb of Cyrus, which we can see here, a beautiful an avenue leading up to it. And here is the tomb itself. Now, I remember when I was living in Jerusalem in 1971, the Iranians celebrated 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy since the first year of Cyrus. Yeah, I can go back there. I thought that most people would know this. So this tomb chamber, which you see here, has a solid stone roof and a door. And the historical sources record that Alexander the Great looted the tomb. Inside was a golden sarcophagus with the body of Cyrus, a golden couch and clothes and other precious objects. And so Pasargadae was the first capital of the Persian Empire until Darius moved the capital to Persepolis. So these are the celebrations that took place in 1971. You can see all the big tents that were erected for the other international visitors. Many nations were invited to attend, but not Israel. Well, it makes me a bit sad, but as you can see from the picture on the bottom left here, Koresh is still a beloved figure in the nation of Israel, and the street in Jerusalem is named after him. So what do we know about Cyrus as a person? He was born about 600 BC in a small Iranian kingdom known as Persia or Fars, and he ruled from 558 till 530 BC. So the Persian Empire lasted for 230 years, from 558 till 330 BC, when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. Cyrus, he was born in Ecbatana, near the modern city of Hamadan. He was the son of Cambyses, the king of Media, and Mandana, the daughter of Astyages. Astyages was the king of the Medes. Now, Herodotus, an historian, reports at least 3 legends about Cyrus' birth and upbringing. The most well-known legend is that his grandfather, Astyages the Mede, was plagued by prophetic nightmares in which he saw his future grandson take over his throne. So when Mandana gave birth to Cyrus, her father Astyages ordered the child to be slain. But a general, Harpagus by name, smuggled the infant to safety in the countryside, where he was raised by a shepherd. So Cyrus grew up to be an outstanding child with qualities of a royal leader. And when Astyages invited him to his court, he recognized his grandson and allowed him to return to his parents in Persia. So I think we can see here a parallel with both Moses and Jesus. As one of the Jewish baby boys, Moses was ordered by the Egyptian king to be drowned in the Nile, but he was saved by divine intervention and raised up as a prince in Egypt. And when he returned to Egypt, he saved the Israelites from slavery and brought them back to the promised land. And we can see a parallel with Jesus, because when he was born, and the world is trying to remember this today, Herod tried to kill all the children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem to be murdered. And again, God had other plans, and an angel took Joseph and Mary to Egypt to escape to Egypt. But Jesus also will come back to establish a new kingdom and bring the Jewish people back to their land. But let's go back to Bible prophecy, and just like his birth, his military success has also been prophesied long before his birth. And we can read these two verses from chapter 41 and 46 in Isaiah. So people had confidence in Cyrus, and everything fell before him. And certain leaders had that kind of effect. So Napoleon, for example, said of his battles that he won that God was sweeping all before him. And other world leaders like Hannibal felt that something supernatural was with them. That was certainly true of Cyrus. When he swept across the world, he would have felt that God was with him, because we just read this in the first 2 verses of chapter 42. So thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose hand I've held, to subdue nations before him, to loose the loins of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you, says God, and make the crooked places straight. I, says God, will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. After having first conquered the kingdom of the Medes and of the Elamites, Cyrus turned his attention to the powerful and wealthy kingdom of Lydia. So Croesus, the king of Sardis, brought the Greek cities of the Mediterranean under his rule, and his capital Sardis benefited from extensive trade links with Mesopotamia. He was very wealthy because of the gold mines near Sardis, and to be as rich as Croesus is a well-known saying. So the richness of the Lydian kingdom came from gold, a natural electrum. First of all, let's look at the citadel. So the citadel we see here was a very powerful citadel built on a very high mountain. You can see it here again beyond the vineyards. So here on top, Croesus had built a very strong citadel. Of course, it is in Turkey. Darius, one of the successors of Cyrus, he built a royal road from Susa, Susan the palace, to Sardis here. So here we see the Pactolus River near Sardis, and gold was melted, came down from the river Tmolus, and here they caught the gold and the silver, which was then smelted in these furnaces. Because the whole site is dedicated to Cybele, which is a kind of a forerunner of the goddess Artemis, or Diana of Ephesians, as she's called there. So here we see some of the gold and silver coins that were minted by Croesus. Now, Croesus, before he was going to attack Cyrus, he had to cross the river Halys, and he asked the oracle in Delphi to know if he should go to war. So the answer came back: if Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire. He thought that he was going to destroy the other empire, but it wasn't so. So he made preparation and went out to battle against the Persian army at this Halys River. Now, the battle was a draw, and Croesus marched his forces back to Sardis, where he disbanded his army for the winter. And he thought that Cyrus would do the same. But Cyrus, he pressed on with the attack and massacred the cavalry of Croesus in the field. Now, the special geological character of the Acropolis of Sardis proved to be its strength, but also its weakness. They thought they were so sheer and impregnable that they didn't always bother to put guards there. But Cyrus had offered large rewards to the first soldiers who would ascend the battlements, but often they were repulsed with great loss. But one Persian soldier saw a Lydian soldier climbing down the walls to retrieve his dropped helmet. So here the Persian soldier sees that the Lydian soldier, he went down from a little gate, and then he followed him afterwards in the night, and that's how they could conquer the city of Sardis. Now, there was a lesson which Jesus told the ecclesia in Sardis in the book of Revelation, because he said in chapter 3 and verse 2 and 3, "Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die. For I have not found your works perfect before God. Remember, therefore, how you have received and heard it. Hold fast and repent. Therefore, if you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you." So that lesson is also vital for us, for Jesus said in Luke 21 and 36, "Watch therefore and pray always that you may count it worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man." So after the fall of Sardis, Croesus' wife committed suicide, and Croesus was dragged before Cyrus in chains, but he saved his life. And then he made Sardis the capital of the newly formed Persian province. So after conquering Sardis, Cyrus took away the enormous wealth that Croesus has accumulated. And again, God had foretold that in the chapter we read, 45 and verse 3, which says, "I'll give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, Yahweh, which called you by thy name, am the God of Israel." So after this, Cyrus went to capture Babylon in 539, which surrendered without a fight. And that also has been prophesied by Daniel the prophet. So in Daniel 5, verse 1 and 2, we read that Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wife and his concubine might drink from. You can see them here on the floor and on the table. So in chapter 5 verse 5, then we read that the fingers of a man's hand, you can see them here, appeared on the lampstand on the plaster of the wall, and the king saw part of the hand that wrote. And then it says in verse 23 to 28, "And you, Belshazzar, have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. They brought down the vessels of his house before you, and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified." Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and the writing was written. And it says here in Hebrew, although from top to bottom, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which means, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That's Daniel 5, verse 23 to 28. So at that time, the prophet Daniel, who translated this, he had stood his ground and he was back in charge. And Cyrus may have wondered who he was. And he would have told him about the prophecy of Isaiah that they had among their treasures. And that was even foretold by Josephus, a historian who lived much later on. We don't have time to read it all, but it says this was known by Cyrus by his reading the book which Isaiah had left behind him of his prophecies. And where did he see the book of Isaiah? And I think it may be quite possible that Daniel showed this, and you can imagine Daniel and Cyrus sitting together reading Isaiah to him, and he would have seen Cyrus that all his history has been sketched out in advance in the Bible. It's amazing to see that the capture of Babylon was foretold. It says in Jeremiah 51 and verse 11, "Make the arrows bright, gather the shields. Yahweh has raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his plan is against Babylon to destroy, because is the vengeance of Yahweh, the vengeance of his temple," because they were drinking from the temple vessels. Now, this is my last slide. Cyrus, before he was told to capture Babylon, was given two tasks. First of all, he says, "He is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, ye shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid," in Isaiah 44 and 28. So Cyrus had to do this not as a king or a general or a conqueror, but as a shepherd. And his upbringing as a shepherd must have trained him to look after God's sheep, just like David was first a shepherd, and then he became king, like it says in Samuel 7 and verse 8. Now therefore, thus shall you say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. Confirmed in the book of Acts. For David, after he had served to his own generation the will of God, he fell asleep. So it's good to be a shepherd, a good start to be a king. So Jesus is ultimately the good shepherd who gives his life for the sheep. In our second talk, tomorrow, God willing, we're going to look how Cyrus fulfilled these tasks as a shepherd that God had given him to do. So let's then conclude in prayer. So yesterday we saw that Cyrus conquered the then known world, coming from the east and going west as far as Sardis. Some historians report that when Cyrus captured Babylon, his army diverted the river Euphrates so they could enter the city under the water gates. And after the capture of Babylon, the empire of Cyrus was established. It will be similar when Christ comes back. For in the book of Revelation, we read about the drying up of the Euphrates, after which Babylon will fall. So here are three quotes from the book of Revelation. The first one, we see that the great river Euphrates was dried up. After that, Babylon was fallen. And then we have an expression of what Babylon stands for, is mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. When Babylon fell to Cyrus, there was great joy among the people. And the same will happen in the future when Jesus will conquer Babylon. And we get this joyful account in Revelation 19, verse 6 to 8. So we see that the wife, as it were, of Christ has made herself ready for the marriage of the Lamb. And I hope that if we follow how the command of Cyrus was followed up by the people, this is a wonderful example for us. And then we got this wonderful vision of Christ in Revelation 19, verse 16, where he's called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, Cyrus called himself King of the world, but he died. In contrast to Cyrus, Christ is alive and will soon return to claim his title and establish his kingdom. Now, there are many types or figures of Christ in the Bible, and we have looked at how Cyrus foreshadowed Christ in his early life. So we looked at the dangers around his birth, and we looked at his conquest, for example. But of course, the thing figured, or the antitype, is much higher than the type itself. But although Cyrus was only a type, it is helpful for our understanding to look at some of his actions. So apart from the main things which we are going to deal with, it's astounding to learn that Cyrus had 10,000 immortals. Cyrus knew all his soldiers by name. Now, of course, Jesus will also have an army, but not now, as he said to Pilate in John 18 and verse 36. But back to the main story. After the capture of Babylon, Cyrus was given two tasks, which you can read in Isaiah 44 and 28. So here we see a drawing of Jerusalem in that time. They started to build the altar, which you can see here, and then they built the temple, and afterwards they repaired under Nehemiah all the walls of the city. Now we read in the beginning of Ezra, the first 2.5 verses, when he called out, "Who is among you of all his people?" And it's identical to the text in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. So this indicates both a fulfillment of prophecy and a continuation of the history of Israel. So the task that God had given Cyrus was to build Jerusalem and lay the foundation of the temple. So Cyrus commanded this to be done, but the people had to do it. So Cyrus was to do that not as a king, but as a shepherd. So Cyrus freed the Jewish exiles, but in a future fulfillment in the last days, Christ will set free the believers from the bondage of sin and death. So the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple as the capital of the future age is exampled in what happened after the command of Cyrus. We've seen this slide before. The policy of Cyrus is sometimes referred to as the first human rights charter in history. So the return of the Jews under leadership of Joshua and Zerubbabel was part of this liberal policy. When Cyrus ordered the restoration of the temple, we can read in Ezra 1 and verse 7 that he also returned the temple vessels that had been defiled by Belshazzar. Also in our time, we've seen that the Jews have returned to their land, and it has been prophesied in Jeremiah 30 and verse 3. So the return to the land happened in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also in 1948. But this is not the final fulfillment. First, the time of Jacob's trouble must come, for Israel has not had any peace since it was established. And we can read now Jeremiah 30, verse 5 to 9. So we look forward to the time when they will really serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So when Christ comes back, a new temple will be built, the one that is described by the prophet Ezekiel. So here we see a reconstruction drawing of the Temple Mount described in the Temple Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This one is only 1,600 cubits square, but Ezekiel's temple will be 3,000 cubits square. When Christ comes back, then all the remaining Jews will be purged, will be cleansed and come back, and a remnant shall be saved, as we can read in Zechariah 13, verse 1, and also in Joel 2 and verse 32. So all the Jews will return to the land, and Jesus will settle them in their tribal allotments, as described in Ezekiel chapter 48. But now let's look at how the temple was rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua and learn lessons from its construction. It's interesting to see that the temple was built in 4 stages. We believe that these stages may be a picture of how an ecclesia, which is also called the house of God, is formed. So the 4 stages are here written on the screen. If you can read it out afterwards. First was to build the altar of the God of Israel. Second was laying the foundation of the temple. Then 3, the house was finished. And the last one was to beautify the house. So Cyrus gave that command, but it took a long time to fulfill. Even Darius the king was involved, and finally Artaxerxes helped to beautify the house of the Lord. So let us go to Jerusalem. So here's an aerial view of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock stands where once the temple stood. The Dome of the Rock is built indeed over the Sagre, the rock, which is a Muslim shrine to commemorate the legendary or mythical night journey of Muhammad and his horse Burak. So let's now look at the first stage, which is the building of the altar. So the first thing was to build the altar. But what do we know about its significance and its location? So here's a picture of an altar in the time of Joshua. In Herod's temple, in the time of Jesus, there was also a great altar. There were 4 fires burning on it, and here a lot of people waiting to have the Passover lamb killed and its blood splashed on the sides of the altar. So the altar was the first thing that was built, and therefore it's the most important part of the temple service. So what can we learn from it? In my research of the Temple Mount, I've been able to locate where the altar stood, just east of the Dome of the Rock. In the time of David, the altar was built in the threshing floor of Araunah. And here we can read in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 18, and also verse 26, that the angel commanded to erect an altar in that threshing floor. So after God had answered him by fire from heaven, then David said, in the next chapter, 22 verse 1, this is the house of Yahweh God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel. So according to tradition, David built his altar in the same place where Isaac was bound. So we can read, please, Genesis 22 verse 8 and 9. So the altars that were built by Abraham and David, by Joshua and Zerubbabel, all point forward to the sacrifice of Christ. It is very important to reflect on an altar because Jesus is our altar. So it has huge implication for us because we can only be saved by the sacrifice of Christ, but it also means, as we can read in Hebrews 13, verse 10 to 14, that we need to go forth unto him outside the camp and bearing his reproach. So it means being separate from the world and dedicating our life to God, following the life of Christ. As it says in Romans 5 verse 10, we are reconciled through the death of Christ, but saved by his life. So having now looked at the first stage when the altar was built, we're now going to look at how the foundation of the temple was built. Now, the foundation of the temple was built around the rock, the Sacha, which is the top of Mount Moriah. And there are many places in the Bible, especially in the book of Psalms, where God is called the rock of our salvation. So we are built around the rock of salvation. Now, a foundation is built of large stones, larger than the rest of the buildings. Now, the first stone that is laid is always laid at a corner, for example, this corner, because it gives direction to the building. So Jesus is that cornerstone of the foundation on which the ecclesia is built. So we can read from 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 5, then we see that Jesus is a living stone, although rejected of men, but we are also living stones, built up a spiritual house. So if we read now in Ephesians 2, verse 19 to 22, then we see that Christ is the cornerstone, and then we need to grow together into a holy temple of the Lord. That's Ephesians 2, verse 19 to 22. So once we are baptized, we need to grow. But how do we grow? There are two very helpful passages, one in 2 Peter 1, verse 5 to 7, and the other one is Hebrews 6, verse 1 to 2. It says, the first one says that we need to add to our faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and then self-control, and all the other things. So the adding of virtue and knowledge to our initial faith is like laying the foundation of the ecclesia. So Hebrews 6, the first two verses, tells us that we must lay the foundation of repentance from dead works and faith toward God and so on, but we need to continue and go on unto perfection. So the foundation represents sound doctrine that was taught by Christ and the apostle. So that is the foundation on which the ecclesia of Christ must be built. So, but how do you build a temple? Of course, with stones. The stone in Jerusalem is limestone, and the temple was built of these limestone blocks. So at first, rough stones are quarried out of the rocky mountainside. It represents humanity, of which we are all part. So then the stones are brought, say, to a mason who is chopping off all the rough edges and turns it into a good-looking stone. It's a wonderful example how we all need to have our rough projections cut off and our edges straightened. Otherwise, we won't fit next to our neighbor. It means that an ecclesia is formed by people that need to put off the old man with his deeds. So it means in spiritual language, as it were, that the old man was crucified with him. That is when we were baptized. The body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin, as it says in Romans 6, verse 6. So in Ephesians 4 and 22, it says we must put off the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. And Colossians says that you mustn't lie to one another, because you've put off the old man with his deeds. But putting off the old man is not enough. We also need to put on the new man. As it says in Galatians, if you're baptized, then you have put on Christ. In Colossians 3, verse 12 to 14, it says we must put on tender mercies and kindness, humility, meekness, and all these things. And above all, we must put on love, which is the bond of perfection. So we are, as it were, now in the quarry, and we must use the experiences in life, whether good or bad, as a necessity to be shaped, to be fit into the temple. That is how Solomon's temple was built, because it says in 1 Kings 6 and verse 7, the temple when it was being built was built of stone, finished at the quarry. Because once the temple is put together, there's no more time for hammering or chiseling or anything else. It's a method that is still used today. Here I'm guiding the masons, because I'm a Christian, guiding 3 Arab masons who are cutting the stones from a rough block to a square stone. So this is Abu Jamil, my main mason. And here are 3 Jewish workers who are building the stones that were cut by the masons on the wall. So we could wonderfully work together. Here I was the supervisor, a Christian. We got 3 Muslims, Arabs, and 3 Jewish people. This man, called David Simon, was my main plasterer. He was an immigrant from Persia, as Iran was called there. He was very proud of his work, which he had learned in Persia and now used in Jerusalem. So he was very proud to show his beautiful work to the professor and myself. So once the stones for the temple are finished in the quarry, then they're transported to the building site. So once Christ comes back to build his living temple, there's no more time for hammering and chiseling us into shape. So we've seen the first stage was building the altar and then laying the foundation, and now the temple is completed. But the last stage was to beautify the temple. And how do you do it? How do you do that? I think it's a wonderful verse in Titus 2, verse 10. We must show all good fidelity or faith, that we may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. And Micah 6 verse 8 shows that God wants us to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And if we do that, as it says in Psalm 149 verse 4, then Yahweh takes pleasure in his people, and he will beautify the humble with salvation. Now, when the temple was completed, there was another wave of people leaving Babylon and going to Jerusalem with Ezra. And it says there on the left, so it says in Ezra 7 and verse 9 that Ezra, he began to go up. And in Hebrew that is called Yesud HaMa'alah. There's an interesting Christadelphian connection, because the ground on which this settlement was built was purchased with Christadelphian donations. That money was raised by Robert Roberts, because from the reading of the Bible, he knew that the Jews needed to return to the land. Because Robert Roberts believed, as all Christadelphians do, that the return of the Jews to the land is a necessary step toward the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. So many Christadelphians go to Yesod HaMa'alah, just north of the Sea of Galilee, and be happy that this settlement can flourish because the Christadelphians bought the ground on which this was built. And now we look forward to the return of Jesus. And for the Jewish people, it will be a shock to realize that Jesus of Nazareth, whom they had crucified, was the promised Messiah. And as it says in Zechariah 10 and 12 and verse 10, that he will pour on the house of David and the house of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, and they will look on me, that's the Lord Jesus, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. Cyrus let the Jews return to the land, but also many other nations. Now Cyrus was a shepherd, and a shepherd loves his sheep. And like a good shepherd, he will show his kindness by gathering the nations from the evils of the world into his fold. So once Jesus has, like a shepherd, gathered his sheep together, then we will be saved and live with him forevermore. And finally, a new temple will be built that shall be a house of prayer for all nations. As it says in Isaiah 56, verse 6 and 7, the sons of the foreigners can join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants. So he will bring to his holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer, says God. And that house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. May it happen soon.
باشد که این موضوع زود اتفاق بیفته.